Good morning from Washington, D.C. Thank you all for being here with us. My name is Lauren Reese. I direct the Environmental Change and Security Program at the Wilson Center. We are very glad to be partnering with the Center for Climate and Security to bring you this PeaceCon panel, Understanding the Climate Change, Violence, and Migration Connection through a closer look at Central America. I want to thank our hosts at USIP and the Alliance for Peace Building for providing the space for this discussion and allowing us to be part of this incredibly important conference. I'll start with a quick word about the Wilson Center and our work. The Wilson Center is a think tank based in Washington, D.C., mandated by Congress to bridge policy, practice, and research. The Environmental Change and Security Program, or ECSP, is focused on connecting the intersection of environment, health, and peace and security issues to foreign policy and international development. One of the best parts of my job is getting to work with a wide array of experts in a wide array of fields and sectors. I've had the privilege of working with Erin Sikorsky, our partner in today's event, in two different capacities. When she was Deputy Director of the Strategic Futures Group on the National Intelligence Council, and today in her role as the Director of the Center for Climate and Security, where she is helping to bring into focus a sharper understanding of climate security risks and how we can shape more effective responses. Erin, why don't you take a minute to introduce CCS?
Sure. Thank you so much, Lauren. And I echo your thanks to USIP and the Alliance for Peace Building for hosting us today and this amazing conference and event. For those of you who don't know, the Center for Climate and Security is a nonpartisan institute focused on the nexus of climate change and national security. We're an institute of the wider Council on Strategic Risks here in Washington. And we facilitate policy development processes and dialogues. We conduct research, we communicate to the public as we're doing today, and act as a resource hub in the climate and security field. So thank you so much, Lauren, for hosting us today.
Thank you, Erin. I'm very anxious to get to our panel, but I want to first share a bit of how we landed on the focus of today's discussion. As practitioners, policymakers, researchers, and activists in the peace building field, you likely have a growing awareness that climate change can impact fragility, violent conflict, and instability. And hopefully you saw the plenary this morning and caught some of the very wise words of those speakers. Maybe you've seen firsthand how something like a prolonged drought or powerful hurricane can compound the risks that communities are already facing. Climate change impacts can affect the availability of resources and interrupt access to basic services and food and water supplies. But they can also further the divide between people and their governments, deepening mistrust, frustration, and the perception that decision makers are failing to meet the needs of their people. The Biden administration has recognized that climate change is reshaping the global landscape and is working to center climate change in foreign policy and national security. There have been a slew of executive orders and climate security documents that detail strategies to better understand and respond to climate's impact on migration and displacement and national security. Against this backdrop, we've seen a steady uptick in the number of devastating headlines about extreme weather. Wildfires, floods, hurricanes, record-breaking heat and cold spells, all of which are forcing people to move. But how climate, migration, and insecurity connect and drive risks is not quite as cut and dry as the headlines would have you believe. And how we look at the problem and find ways forward requires that we think differently about risk and about resilience. One of the challenges of responding to climate risks is that climate's impacts and how those impacts interact with existing systems on the ground are so varied and specific to a given place. But there's also an opportunity in how we respond to develop more agile, just, and sustaining programs and policies that go beyond a singular focus on responding to climate change and instead build the overall resilience of communities. By grounding today's discussion in Central America, specifically the countries of Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, we hope to shine some light on this complicated set of risks and where there are potential entry points for more effective responses. This is a region suffering from political instability, a lack of employment opportunities, and high levels of violence. All of these factors are driving an unprecedented number of migrants within the region and at the US's southern border. It's a high priority region for the Biden administration. One of President Biden's first acts after he took office was to sign an executive order to create a comprehensive regional framework to address and manage irregular migration in Central America. Irregular migration referring to the movement of people that takes place outside of laws and regulations. There have been high-profile visits to the region, including by Vice President Harris and the USAID Administrator, Samantha Power. Then SCE released a strategy to address the root causes of migration in the region, and USAID launched a Northern Triangle Task Force. There's also the Central America Regional Security Initiative focused on bolstering law enforcement and the justice sector. Now, the focus of these frameworks and strategies is largely on combating corruption, countering and preventing violence and organized crime, and addressing human rights and economic insecurity in the region. And this is for good reason. The challenges in the region are immense and their implications for the US are enormous. But at the same time, Latin America and the Caribbean is the second most disaster-prone region in the world. How we understand climate change's impact on the region and develop responses cannot be siloed from efforts to stabilize the region, to develop its economic strength, to ensure that people are not forced to move and that there is a choice to stay home and safe and sanctioned pathways for those who choose to leave. And we understand that the very challenges undermining peace and prosperity in the region also undermine communities' ability to manage climate risks. So how can we leverage the investments, the policies, and the tools that we have and are developing to complement one another and to be more accessible to the communities of practice working in the region? How do we ensure that in our efforts to do good, we don't unintentionally worsen tensions or undermine local resilience? And how do we meaningfully engage with communities and integrate their knowledge in our responses? Just a few small questions. So let's turn to some experts to get the conversation started. Our panelists today represent diverse perspectives and experiences. Susan Kandel is the Executive Director of the Regional Program of Research on Development and Environment, PRISMA, a policy-oriented research institute on issues of development and environment in Mesoamerica. Miriam Miranda is the leader of the Black Fraternal Organization of Honduras, where she leads efforts to counter land theft by big tourism businesses, reclaim ancestral territories formerly belonging to Garifuna communities, stop drug traffickers, promote sustainable environmental practices, and support community leadership development for youth and women. And of course, Aaron Sikorsky, Director of the Center for Climate and Security and the International Military Council on Climate and Security. Aaron was also the founding chair of the Climate Security Advisory Council, a congressionally mandated group designed to facilitate coordination between the intelligence community and US government scientific agencies. Unfortunately, Roger Polwardy from NOAA was unable to join us because he is experiencing his own minor health, well, not necessarily minor, but a household disaster with a frozen and burst pipe and is in cleanup mode. So we hope he jumps in, but there's a slim chance of that happening, unfortunately. I would like to start with you, Aaron. I think you have a unique perspective given your decade plus in leading much of the US intelligence community's environmental and climate security analyses. How would you characterize the way that climate change is altering what we think we know about security? And in that question, there's kind of two parts, right? There's the how is it altering what we think we know, and how should it be altering what we know, and there are some gaps there.
Yeah, no, thank you, Lauren. That's a great question to start off with. And I just want to say it's such an honor to be on the panel with Susan and Miriam, and I'm really looking forward to learning from them today in this discussion. But when you pose this question, I was thinking about my career in the U.S. government, and I before I led environment and climate analysis, I led teams that were looking at conflict and political risks in the Middle East and East Africa. And as I led those teams, and we on the team debated what we needed to write about, how we needed to assess risks of conflict, what we found was that increasingly over the years, issues related to environment and climate change were front and center in driving some of those risks, and they were changing what we knew about other risks in the region, and we weren't very well equipped, frankly, to assess some of those risks. And I would think that many of the folks on this call today, if you don't work on climate change full time, but you work on conflict and peace in different regions of the world, you've had a similar experience over the years as the climate shocks become more acute. They're reshaping, as Lauren mentioned, the security landscape with extreme weather, too little or too much rain, sea level rise, heat waves. All of these are upending core planning assumptions about how the world works. The past is no longer a good predictor of the future, and there really is no analog in many of these places that we can look to historically for what to expect when temperatures rise above wet bulb temperature, the temperature that humans can be outside, for example, or rain patterns change in such a way that subsistence agriculture is no longer sustainable in the way it once was. So everything from our very micro understandings about how communities manage resource access, for example, or to broader agreements between states over shared river basins, to international organizations and institutions and their assessments of where and when conflict is likely, all of these are shifting. And we need to bring that climate perspective and climate analysis into understanding that shift and where we're going. I think the other thing I would highlight here is that climate change for the security community and the peace building community underscores the false dichotomy between so-called hard and soft security issues. Actorless, borderless risks like pandemics and climate change are having real and wide-ranging, quote unquote, hard security implications, right? You cannot forecast the likelihood of conflict in fragile states, for example, without exploring how climate change is contributing to that instability now. You can't understand extremist trajectories without digging into how the opportunity cost, right, of joining a violent extremist group is lowered when the effects of climate change are eliminating an ability to make a livelihood from farming, for example, right? So it's not that climate's over here and the real security issues are over here. They overlap and they intersect. And as Lauren said, they compound one another. And so I think we can talk about this more in other questions, but there's the direct risks, the compounding risks, and the resilience piece, and how climate change, I think that's the last thing I'll say here, is understanding how even when climate change is not directly involved in spurring conflict, it's undermining the resilience of communities to be able to absorb other shocks, right? And so when something else then happens, security related, if you've been having waves of hurricanes, for example, or waves of droughts over many years, you're not able to manage other different shocks that come in, and neither are governments in key regions. So those are just a few thoughts based on that question, Lauren.
Thanks, Erin. I think it also reflects something that I caught the panel this morning, and Andy Revkin, who's been covering climate risks since the late 80s, talked about how, climate is definitely shaping a new landscape of risk, but in his experience, the social climate, he said, is a more powerful determinant of outcomes, right? And so finding ways to make sure that the science is not siloed from our understanding of what's actually happening in communities. There's been an evolution in the disaster risk reduction community as well, to move from a focus on responding to what you could almost say is on the surface of a disaster, what happened, who was affected, et cetera, to a more systematic approach that integrates knowledge, uncertainty, the potential for surprises, in other words, the underlying structures and drivers that interact to produce complex risks. Susan and Miriam, I'd love to turn to you now to get your insights into what those structures are in the context of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Susan, Prisma works to strengthen livelihoods and territorial governance processes led by rural and indigenous communities in Central America. Can you talk a little bit about how the groups you're working with are experiencing the impacts of climate change on their livelihoods and their decisions to move?
Yeah, to answer this question, or to understand the experiences and responses to climate change of rural and indigenous communities in Central America, it's first necessary to ask, why is Central America one of the most vulnerable regions to climate change in the world, as well as recognize that vulnerability is a socially constructed condition and must be understood as a result of various, like we've said, social, economic, and political processes that are permanently interacting and influencing these conditions of extreme vulnerability. And in the case of Central America, to begin with, Central America faces, and the Northern Triangle countries face, a series of social economic conditions associated with high levels of poverty, limited access to resources, and growing inequality. Along with this, there's a trend in all the countries to promote economic growth based on extractivist activities and industries. And these activities are permanently transforming land use dynamics in the region. So they're further intensifying, resulting in systematic patterns of social exclusion and environmental degradation. not only in environmental terms, such as deforestation, biodiversity loss, and soil erosion, but in the collapse of livelihoods, reinforcing the massive outmigration that we have seen in the recent years. All of these factors interact and help explain why there is such a proliferation of conflicts and disputes over the control of land, water, and forests in the region. Moreover, this is leading to an increasing use of violence to dispossess people of their territories and resources, as well as strategies of criminalization against environmental defenders and communities that are resisting these dynamics. In synthesis, this is leading to a problem of governance, and more so when we take into account that the countries in the Northern Triangle are in the midst of an institutional crisis, a crisis of the rule of law, increasing corruption, authoritarianism, militarization, and linked to all this, a rise in actions with diverse illicit actors. Accordingly, the responses of rural and indigenous communities and social movements in Central America are varied and really wide-ranging, depending on the different contexts and specific territorial dynamics they face. We recently did a mapping of these different types of territorial actors, and we found that you have territorial actors who are resisting the extractivist activities in defense of their territory. And these probably are the actors most on the front line that confront the most aggressive and violent context characterized by the expansion of mining, infrastructure projects, or the advance of monocultures or narco ranching, cattle ranching. And building resistance in these circumstances requires defending the rights of communities over their resources that constitute the material base of their livelihoods, together with defending their practices and collective action institutions that give meaning to their communities. There's also a whole group of territorial actors focused on building adaptation and resilience, especially in really environmentally degraded territories, agricultural degraded territories. Interestingly, these actors do not necessarily organize their efforts under the banner of mitigating or adapting to climate change, but instead tend to frame their struggles as issues such as food security and sovereignty, the right to water, and those types of issues. And they don't necessarily identify themselves as climate actors, but they are key actors. And then there's other territorial actors in the region that with more ambitious and larger scale initiatives that have found in the agenda, the mitigation agenda, an opportunity to strengthen their local economies, as well as a forum for the defense of their rights, which has allowed them to mobilize significant external support, as in the case of community forestry management by forest communities and indigenous groups throughout the region. And then we also see a group of actions of some more national organizations, many of them more urban-based, that are beginning to adopt agendas that increasingly are making these links between issues of human rights to issues of territorial governance. All of these actors are addressing the causes of vulnerability, poverty, exclusion, environmental degradation, while they do not frame their efforts necessarily as climate actions. In general, their efforts are all grounded in nature-based solutions to climate events, such as how they manage agriculture, forests, and other land uses. I'll stop there and let Miriam give examples more concrete about what that means at a community level.
Thank you, Susan. I think it's really helpful to have sort of the landscape of actors working in this space. And I think that point that what they're doing might not be sort of named in terms of climate response, but is part of the broader climate response is a really important one as well. Miriam, I mean, you've dedicated decades to protecting the human and environmental rights of indigenous communities and your own people, the Garifuna in Honduras. And I'm sorry, you'll have to make sure that correct me in my pronunciation. A large part of this work has been to protect communities from forced displacement. In a recent article, you wrote that not only are anti-migrant messages dehumanizing and wrong, they miss a key point. Most migrants would prefer to stay in their homes. So I'd love to hear from you. If you want to start actually by talking a little bit about your people and the communities that you're working in, and then share with us the key barriers that you see that are getting in the way of allowing communities to stay where they would like to.
Muchísimas gracias. Es un placer participar con ustedes el día de hoy. Un saludo a nuestra compañera que pues ya hace mucho tiempo estamos participando en algunos eventos aquí con la compañera y realmente pues me parece que con Susan nos hemos encontrado en varios espacios para tratar estos temas. Y no sé si escuchan la interpretación. ¿Escuchan la interpretación? Bueno, yo estaba escuchando un poquito la participación del Ering. Me parece que cuando hablaba del término seguridad y cambio climático, que es un tema que hoy por hoy pues como que define mucho lo que son las políticas de los estados respecto a la crisis climática. Y me parece que ya no podemos seguir hablando ahora de la crisis climática, el cambio climático, sin tomar en cuenta que la raíz por qué estamos en crisis, por qué estamos en una crisis ambiental, climática, ¿por qué? O sea, yo creo que no podemos ya olvidar que los recursos naturales están agotándose, que hoy como nunca hay una disputa por los territorios, por el control de los recursos naturales. No debemos olvidar eso. No debemos olvidar que en las últimas centurias se ha sobreexplotado los recursos naturales, creyendo la humanidad y los seres humanos que son inagotables. Y nos está demostrando que sí, los recursos se agotan. Y como se agotan, hay que buscar recursos para un modelo de consumo insostenible que hemos venido, digamos así, viviendo en las últimas centurias y sobre todo en los últimos 100 años, creyendo que podíamos usarlos como quisiéramos siempre. Y hoy por hoy, el clima nos está diciendo, hay un peligro para la humanidad, existe un peligro para la humanidad. Es el clima que nos está diciendo eso. Entonces no se trata de cambiar el clima, se trata de cambiar ese modelo de consumo. Y es algo como que no se quiere entender cuando estamos hablando de la crisis climática. Se habla de la vulnerabilidad, se habla de todas las tormentas tropicales, todos los efectos que se están dando. Se está deshaciendo el hielo en la Antártida. Hay una razón, y es que ya no podemos seguir con este modelo de consumo, porque nos estamos autosuicidando. Es un autosuicidio de la humanidad, que yo creo que es importante entender eso, que llegó la hora de poner atención a la forma como consumimos. ¿Qué consumimos? Porque los recursos están agotándose. Toda la disputa, por supuesto, genera lo que han hablado, ¿verdad? Violencia, inseguridad, migración. Esos son como los efectos de ese problema, de los efectos que ha generado el consumo desmesurado de los recursos naturales que nos sirven a la humanidad para vivir. Si nosotros no tocamos ese punto, vamos a volver en ese círculo vicioso de analizar la crisis climática sin tomar en cuenta la raíz. Y como hay que tomar en cuenta la raíz, por eso se deben de generar soluciones reales, verdaderas. El tema de la migración, el tema de cómo la gente nuestra está migrando, que genera por la violencia, la inseguridad y todo eso. Yo he venido insistiendo que en las comunidades, en los pueblos, en los países de América Latina y del mundo tenemos derecho a quedarnos. Y para eso se deben de construir las condiciones en los países nuestros. Los gobiernos deben de responder para generar bienestar, para no seguir invirtiendo en empresas que destruyen la naturaleza, para no seguir invirtiendo en modelos que lo que están haciendo es desplazando las comunidades. Y de esa manera nosotros vamos a poder responder a esta crisis climática, porque la gente está saliendo, hay un modelo de consumo y de producción que destruye, como por ejemplo en el caso de Honduras. No es posible que hasta en las laderas se esté sembrando palma africana en detrimento de los alimentos básicos. Centroamérica, Honduras, era uno de los países primeros productores en arroz. Podíamos venderle a todo Centroamérica, muchos países de Centroamérica. Y hoy, después de Colombia, somos el país más productor de palma africana, palma aceitera. ¿Para quién? ¿Para qué es esa palma africana? Cuando nosotros necesitamos frijoles, arroz, necesitamos alimentos básicos, productos básicos. Entonces, ahí está de nuevo ese elemento que me refiero cuando hay un modelo de producción equivocado que contribuye a generar mayor crisis climática. La palma africana no puede ser que la estemos priorizando sobre los alimentos básicos. Entonces, para terminar en esta parte, me parece de que debemos de también discutir y ver las otras opciones de la energía. La energía es la que mueve hoy el mundo. La búsqueda de energía, de cómo generar más energía, si no es eólica, si no es porque ya se está botando el petróleo y las otras cosas. Ya tenemos que entender de que los recursos se están agotando y que tenemos que poner atención como seres humanos y humanas en la necesidad de hacer un replanteo, inclusive a nivel individual y colectivo, comunitario, de las ciudades, de los países, respecto a este modelo de consumo que cada día nos está orillando más a desaparecer. Eso es importante y para eso tenemos que tomar decisiones radicales respecto a la atención de la crisis climática. Por aquí lo dejo por ahora. Gracias, Laura.
Thank you, Miriam. I think that's a really very important point about how we've gotten to where we are today and the importance of taking that into consideration as we think towards a renewable energy transition, right? As we try to transition away from fossil fuels, ensuring that that transition is more just and avoid some of the sort of complicated and challenging scenarios that we've gotten ourselves into today. Miriam, can you just take a minute to tell us about your people, the Garifuna?
Miriam?
I don't know if
I don't think she heard that you made the question to her back.
Okay. Carlos, can you ask her to give us just tell us a little bit about the community that she comes from, the Garifuna?
Garifuna.
How do you say it, Susan?
Garifuna.
Thank you.
Miriam, tienes apagado
Claro
su
que sí,
micrófono.
claro que sí, yo soy garífuna, afroindígena, vivimos en la costa atlántica de Honduras y creo que es importante esa pregunta, Erin, porque los pueblos que vivimos en la costa, que habitamos en las costas de Mesoamérica y el mundo, somos de los pueblos con mayor vulnerabilidad de la crisis climática. Ustedes ven lo que está pasando en muchas costas, no solamente en las costas de Centroamérica, costas del sur, sino que también en las costas de los países de allá del Asia, ¿no? O sea, no solamente son, digamos, las tormentas tropicales, como lo que fue el ETA y OTA que enfrentamos el año pasado, sino que también como comunidad garífuna estamos enfrentando una gran crisis que es el tema de la sedimentación del mar y que tiene que ver precisamente en el caso del pueblo garífuna, que lo hemos visto cómo se han venido desarrollando procesos y proyectos de explotación de los bosques, no solamente explotación de los bosques. Aquí muy cerca de la ciudad donde yo vivo se instaló una termoeléctrica de búnker, algo que ya no existe en ninguna parte del mundo, porque claro, y a escasos kilómetros hacia la playa. Imagínense ustedes lo que significa tener una termoeléctrica a escasos metros del mar, todo lo que, digamos, emite y toda la toxicidad, todos los recursos, digamos, los residuos de esta termoeléctrica va a dar al mar, y eso afecta a las comunidades, pero hay un elemento que casi no se habla mucho también, que tiene que ver con la crisis climática, es cómo se está sobreexplotando los recursos de los ríos. Ustedes ya podrán entender, Susan, creo que con todo el estudio que hace Prisma se dan cuenta que ahora tenemos que también tomar en cuenta no solamente lo que pasa en el mar y cómo, sino que también los efectos de los ríos, cómo discurren hacia la playa, hacia el mar, y hay un efecto fuerte cuando estos ríos son sobreexplotados, que están sacándose las piedras, se están sacando la arena, la tierra para digamos, construcción. O sea, el tema del cambio, la crisis climática nos, digamos, nos obliga como a hacer unos análisis integral de la problemática ambiental. Es como el plástico, ¿no? O sea, el plástico, ¿a dónde va a dar? Al mar. Y entonces ahora tenemos grandes extensiones cubiertas de playas y ríos de plástico. Todo el mundo conoce lo que ha pasado con el río Motagua, ¿no? La crisis que hay entre Guatemala y Honduras por ese río, que dice el gobierno de Guatemala que es responsabilidad de Honduras, el gobierno de Honduras es responsabilidad de Guatemala, porque ahí tenemos un gran lago de plástico, ¿verdad? Generado por esta gran crisis, esta cuestión de lo que estamos viendo. Entonces ahí, y hablando un poco de las falsas soluciones, que yo creo que es importante ese mensaje que voy a dar. Aquí en Honduras se ha implementado y se ha comenzado a dar en los supermercados, aunque no es la parte de la pregunta, Erin, pero yo quiero hacer como un análisis general sobre eso, como una respuesta supuestamente al tema de la crisis climática ambiental. Se le dice a la gente, mira, ya no te vamos a dar bolsas de plástico para que tú lleves las cosas a tu casa, ¿no? Cuando compras. Pero el 90%, si tú entras a un supermercado, a una tienda, 90% de las cosas están empacadas en plástico. Entonces no hay ninguna lógica, ¿verdad? De que no le permitan a la gente no llevar bolsas de plástico que al final las van a reusar en su casa, cuando llevan todos los productos que compran están envueltos en plástico, y hasta con algunas barbaridades que se están dando ahora, que productos que aquí mismo se venden, que la gente se escandaliza, que ahora ya las envuelven también en plástico. Entonces yo creo de que cuando estamos hablando de falsas soluciones, estamos hablando de eso, hacer un análisis completo de qué es lo que está pasando con la comunidad de garífuna. Quiero decirle, con esto termino, habitamos a lo largo de la costa atlántica, no solamente enfrentamos lo que son los proyectos los proyectos que están desplazando las comunidades, también estamos enfrentando grupos criminales y narcotraficantes que están lavando, que son propietarios de grandes extensiones de tierra ahora hoy día, y están produciendo palma africana. O sea, eso es como una cuestión, un círculo, porque no hay control, no hay una política de Estado para realmente tomar una decisión de generar mejores condiciones, pero también de generar conciencia y sobre todo de buscar la prevención sobre este efecto que nos está desgastando a nivel de los países nuestros. No es posible que, por ejemplo, en las comunidades nuestras se siga implementando esos megaproyectos turísticos que destruyen la naturaleza, que también son inviables. Hoy día con una pandemia nadie quiere viajar, muy poca gente, pero se sigue pensando en esas respuestas. ¿Por qué? Porque al final de cuentas hay como una visión de que el clima se va a resolver con dinero. O sea, hay también esa visión de que el clima nosotros lo podemos resolver poniendo plata. Yo creo que también hay que cambiar comportamiento, hay que cambiar modelos. Pueden dar los millones que se den. Nosotros lo vimos en esta y otra. Comunidades que vieron desaparecer sus casas, la gente, comunidades, centros urbanos, como de lo que es ciudad de San Pedro Sula, anegada como que fuera cualquier zona. O sea, algo impresionante. Y si ante eso nosotros no tomamos, digamos, conciencia, pero también no nos asustamos porque como que estamos perdiendo ya el miedo, ¿no? Como humanidad, Entonces algo está pasando, entonces estamos normalizando todas esas cosas que no son normales. Creo que tiene que ver también con eso, ¿no? Digamos, los mensajes que también se emiten por los medios de comunicación. Entonces la gente lo ven, van normalizando todo eso. Y una de las cosas que hemos estado peleando, por ejemplo, a nivel de todas nuestras comunidades, porque el paisaje que hoy hay una generación de 30 años para acá, que su paisaje es el plástico en las comunidades. Es parte de su paisaje y lo ven como normal. Entonces yo creo que ahí hay algunos elementos que hay que tomar en cuenta respecto a esta situación y también las industrias extractivistas que están siendo aprobadas y apoyadas, más bien impulsadas por el Estado. Entonces yo creo que ahí hay una situación muy grave de la falta de visión y de toma de decisión inteligente, diría yo, y de los tomadores de decisión, valga la redundancia. Los tomadores de decisión, hoy por hoy, necesitamos que tengan conciencia de que hay un peligro, que existe un peligro y que por lo tanto tenemos que tomar correcciones a tiempo antes de que desaparezcamos como seres humanos y humanas. Gracias.
Thanks, Miriam. I think that you laid out in a very compelling way how from the micro to the macro, this sort of, I like this idea of false solutions, right? You're saying you can't take a grocery or use plastic bags at a grocery store, but then the fruit is individually wrapped in plastic, right? So this idea that if we're not looking at sort of things holistically, we're going to really make these very basic mistakes. But then also connecting to that higher level of decision making and ensuring that the decisions that are being made from the city level on up are sort of recognizing the long-term implications of the decisions that they're making and avoiding this normalization. Another good point of how we are seeing our current context and recognizing that we need to be having sort of better aspirations, higher expectations for our own behavior. Erin, I'd like to come back to you and just get back to some of the understanding around climate risks. And, you know, I think the research on climate change's interaction with mobility and displacement has evolved a lot over the last 2 decades, I'd say, but there's still, I wouldn't say it's solved, right? And so could you give us some comments about how you see the pathways through which climate change is contributing to displacement and instability, and where you think there's a need for more research and better nuanced understanding?
Sure, no, I can do that, but real briefly, I just wanted to respond to a few points that Miriam made, which I thought were so useful. One is that making sure we're expanding our aperture a bit, our scope beyond just climate issues to broader ecological issues as well, and ecological security. And many of the things she discussed are kind of include climate, but go beyond climate as well, which I think is important. And the other thing she mentioned, and you just mentioned now as well, Lauren, is this idea of making sure that our adaptations and responses to some of the climate shocks don't make problems worse. And I think we at the Center for Climate and Security a few years ago released a plan called A Responsibility to Prepare and Prevent. And part of that, the impetus for that report was we need to respond to the climate shocks that are already here and baked in, given the amount of carbon in the atmosphere and the warming. But we also then need to take action to make sure that we're mitigating for the future as well. And that those mitigation plans, the energy transition, as we're talking about, is a just transition and then doesn't make those adaptation and resilience challenges we're currently facing worse. And I think that holding those two things at the same time is challenging, but critically important, as Miriam has laid out in her remarks. But to your question on the pathways for climate change and migration and climate change and instability, you know, when it comes to migration, and I don't think this is a surprise to anyone on this call, but there are usually 2 different pathways that we talk about. One is related to the acute shocks, right, of climate change. So when you have a storm like a typhoon or a hurricane, or you have a flood and people need to flee quickly in response to that shock, often those populations move back. You know, it's a temporary displacement. And that's one kind of pathway, although if you have a lot of those shocks over time and they come very rapidly, then people may choose to move or be forced to move because it's hard to rebuild over time. The second pathway is a more slow onset stressors. And this is when you have degradation of farmland over time, the salinization of fresh water basins, right? Unlivable temperatures you can't work in certain temperatures. And that happens more slowly and is often not, as we've already been discussing, not just climate driven, but climate intersecting with other things, governance, as we've talked about quite a bit, and other issues as well. Data from UNHCR shows that over the last decade, though, that weather-related crises have triggered more than twice as much displacement as conflict and violence. And since 2010, extreme weather has forced around 21.5 million people a year to move on average. So it's, as you said, it's complicated, right? There are the weather shocks and the extreme events, and then there is the more slow onset problems that intersect with a lot of these other issues we've been talking about. I think it's important also to remember that sometimes migration can be a positive adaptation strategy in response to some of these challenges, but it can precipitate instability and conflict when it's combined with some of these other challenges. The other thing I'll mention is that climate migration usually occurs within countries. I think that's an important part of the conversation as well, rural to urban. And I think that some of the instability challenges you can see with that is when states are not prepared for large numbers of people moving, when you already have stressed cities that are facing perhaps violence challenges, governance challenges of their own, and then you add new folks into that mix is where you get some real crises. On the instability front, the last thing I'll say, and I know we're focused on Central America, but I do think this point about climate shocks or climate stressors undermining state resilience, a really good example of this that I've been thinking about a lot lately is what's been happening in Ethiopia and the conflict there. And the key driver of that current conflict is clearly political. But when you look at the climate change record in the region over the recent decades, you can clearly see increased vulnerability there, where they've had decreases in annual rainfall in the Tigray region where the conflict was sparked. You've had an increase in mean temperatures over the past 40 years that has hurt farmers. You've had negative feedback loops between climate vulnerabilities and social and economic developments. You had the locust plague in 2020, which was in part climate driven. And so climate change destabilizes, right, the communities there. And you can't understand that conflict environment and what's driving people to move and migrate without bringing that climate change lens in, even though that's not the key driver of the current conflict. And I think that example applies to a lot of different places around the world, and why it's so, again, important to understand that resilience piece, that resilience is all about being flexible and able to absorb shocks, right? And climate really erodes that. Climate change is eroding that in a lot of places that were already had low resilience to begin with. And that's a key pathway, I think, to instability, but why it is so complex as well, because it's not A to B, right? In the discussion, as Miriam and Susan have both elaborated.
Thank you, Erin. I want to mention for those of you participating, you can go ahead and put your questions in the chat. I think there's like a chat and there's a Q&A box. I think that you should be able to just use the chat though. And I'm gonna tell our panelists they don't need to worry about watching the chat. I'd like you to focus on the conversation, and I will multitask here and try to bring some of those questions into the discussion. Oh, there's a question already. Okay, we'll come back to that in just a minute. Susan, in a lot of the analysis and literature on migration and mobility and displacement, there's an acknowledgement first that our international regimes and regulatory frameworks are outdated and not responsive to current trends and drivers of movement, like climate change, like many of those that Erin just touched on. Most climate change and mobility scenarios fall outside of all legal frameworks. Regional governance, though, can offer a more practical response to climate migration and displacement. We're seeing there's some examples of that in the Caribbean, in the Pacific Islands, in Africa. Thinking about Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, I'd be interested to hear from you how regional governance is shaping migration pathways, where you see there are opportunities to do a better job in the region and in supporting communities.
Okay, small question. As discussed previously, the interrelationship between political and economic processes and social and environmental impacts are deeply entwined and related to issues of governance. And in this particular context, climate change and the governance of that, and Central America and the conditions, in this context, governance really specifically refers to the social relationships that shape how resources are used, who will benefit from them, and how these decisions are made. So like Miriam said, a dispute over control over resources. Accordingly, decisions over the use and destination of land and other natural resources directly impact the potential for building resilience. And kind of referring back, we use what Erin referred to as the Fccc definition of resilience. And I just want to put it on the radar because I think it's important when you're thinking of pathways, an agenda of resilience. And it's defined as the ability of the social ecological system to cope with an event or disturbance by responding or organizing itself in such a way that it maintains its essential function, its identity, and its structure, while preserving the capacity for adaptation, learning, and transformation. So accordingly, marginalized rural communities and indigenous people need to be put in the driver's seat when it comes to making decisions about how land and other resources are used. They're on the front lines, as Miriam was pointing out. It's promising. You mentioned earlier that the Biden administration already recognizes the direct interrelationship between addressing the governance crisis in the region, as well as building resilience, and as well, the crucial role civil society and local organizations play in building resilience and addressing the root causes of migration. So that's good. And that's a starting point. So where do we need to go from there? And talking about regional governance and international governance structures, it's really important that they create at least two mechanisms that would significantly help put rural communities and indigenous people in the driver's seat in the first place. One of them is a mechanism to strengthen and scale up successful local climate resilient efforts led by territorial actors on the ground. They do have solutions, and we need to scale them up and mobilize that knowledge. They were on the ground knowing the specific conditions, and that's the only way you can adapt and build resilience. And then and that requires ensuring that climate funds, all these climate funds actually reach frontline territorial actors on what they're doing. But there's also another side to this that has to do with the strategies in general. We need a mechanism to make sure that investments and financing come into the region do no harm. In most cases, investments and financing favor conventional strategies of growth and development tied to extractivist mega projects that actually undermine resilience building efforts. Renewable energy initiatives, for example, are highly contentious in the Northern Triangle. Biofuel initiatives based on sugarcane and African palm oil expansion have led to land grabbing, reducing access to land, and triggered many local conflicts as local communities and indigenous peoples have seen ecosystems vital for their livelihoods threatened by such developments. Larger hydro projects have also been sources of corruption and unprecedented violence against environmental defenders, such as the case of Berta Cáceres in Honduras. In other words, it is essential to develop mechanisms that ensure adequate conditions for real informed, prior informed consulting mechanisms and for building agreements with local communities and indigenous people about how land use is decided, land use change is decided. And I'll leave it there for now.
Oh, Miriam, please.
Sí, Miriam.
Muchísimas gracias, muchísimas gracias. Pedí, más bien puse la mano ahí porque me hace mucho ruido algunas cosas de las que planteaba en este momento Susan, que me parece que es muy importante a tomar en cuenta, pero que también hay que clarificarlo. Cuando hablamos de que los pueblos indígenas, los pueblos afro, pueblos negros, las comunidades locales estamos enfrente, que estamos allí, es porque hemos venido protegiendo sus recursos, hemos venido cuidándolos. Sin embargo, a pesar de que esos recursos existen, gracias a que los pueblos, la mayoría de los pueblos, o hemos venido protegiendo esos recursos, se nos dice que somos antidesarrollo. Cuando ahí nos oponemos a un proyecto de industria extractivista para poder destruir los recursos, para poder extraer los recursos que a la hora de la hora ni siquiera nos ayudan a nosotros. Por eso no es casual que algunos ríos que han sido represados, que han instalado represas, los pueblos y las comunidades cercanas a esa represa ni siquiera tienen electricidad. Hay muchos ejemplos en América Latina y en el mundo. Entonces yo creo que es importante, Susan, compañeros y compañeras, de ya discutir y analizar sobre ese concepto de desarrollo. Ya no podemos hablar de que el desarrollo, esa idea que le dicen a la gente en las comunidades o en la campaña que hay, mira, si vamos a tirar carreteras de cemento o vamos a abrir grandes brechas de carreteras y vamos a ponerle cemento, ¿para qué es? ¿Quién se beneficia de eso? Pero a eso le dicen que es desarrollo. O sea, ese concepto equivocado de desarrollo, que yo creo que tenemos que comenzar a desconfigurar eso, ¿no? O sea, ¿qué significa desarrollo? ¿Desarrollo para quién? ¿Para qué? ¿Qué carajo es eso? Porque a la gente se le dice, mira, nosotros te vamos a darte cuáles son las cosas que hacen para que la gente acepta o le llegan con esos proyectos de industrias extractivistas que la gente ni siquiera sabe qué es. Que a veces la gente dice, ¿será que es marca de tortilla o qué? Porque la gente no sabe qué es. Pero le llegan con unos planes ya elaborados en la cual alguien de allá de la capital, como lo que ha sido el ejemplo de nosotros, llegaron y dijeron, aquí hay una mina de hierro y esa mina de hierro, que es una montaña a veces sagrada de las comunidades, le dicen, vamos a explotar esa mina de hierro. Alguien que llegó de allá, que podría decir que llegó de Marte, ¿no? O sea, ¿y cómo es que llegó allí? ¿Por qué? ¿Quién le dio permiso? Entonces, a mí me parece que es importante abrir ese debate sobre el tema de lo que significa lo que es desarrollo. Hay que desconstruir eso, hay que pensarlo, hacerla pensada, cómo llegan a las comunidades. Y es también, recordemos, que es una narrativa que se fue construyendo para aceptar esa forma y ese modelo de disque desarrollo que lo que hace es explotar los recursos. Y ahora, estamos nosotros enfrente defendiendo esos recursos desde hace mucho tiempo, pero tenemos gente criminalizada y judicializada por defender el agua. Justo ahora, hace una semana, está la audiencia de los compañeros de Guapinol y todos los días le van poniendo más y le van incluyendo más, digamos, delitos. Igual tenemos justo ahora en Trujillo, ahí está el compañero Leonard Brown, que es de la comunidad garífuna y está siendo judicializado por defender la tierra. Y eso es lo que nosotros estamos sometidos y sometidas en este sistema. Defendemos la tierra, defendemos los recursos, defendemos el agua, pero a la par el sistema de justicia, aplicación de justicia, nos criminaliza, nos judicializa. Y cuando estamos defendiendo estos recursos, estamos defendiendo la vida. Precisamente estamos construyendo y diciéndole, miren, señores, no podemos explotar la tierra y los recursos de esa manera porque nos va a afectar. Y eso lo hemos dicho cuando vamos a la ciudad capital. Ese río que estamos defendiendo en el campo, esa agua y ese bosque le sirve a la gente que está en la zona urbana. Porque la comida se produce en el área rural. Ahí se produce. Yo cuando les digo, mira, aquí en la capital de Tegucigalpa no se pega ni un árbol de limón y algunas compañeras se molestan, ¿verdad? Porque tienen tal vez un limoncito en su patio en Tegucigalpa, pero les digo, miren, si aquí no se produce eso, la comida y los alimentos se producen en el área rural y por lo tanto es una responsabilidad de la gente urbana, de todos y cada uno de nosotros, poder proteger y garantizar que haya agua para la producción de alimentos. Entonces ahí creo que es importante entender eso, que una de las cosas que si estamos pensando en generar condiciones en cómo poder defender y poder lograr soluciones para la crisis climática es detener la criminalización y la judicialización de los defensores de los recursos naturales. Hoy por hoy en América Latina y en el mundo, los que defendemos los recursos, defendemos la vida, más bien nos tratan como delincuentes, como que estuviéramos cometiendo un delito. Ahí quería dejarlo. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Miriam. I think those points are extremely important and help us move the conversation towards, so how do we need to be doing things differently, right? How do we do a better job of developing solutions that actually support the communities? And I think your point about sort of development for whom, for what, is a really important one that comes into a lot of different conversations that we have, and thinking about how you set up the decision-making processes so that community members are part of the takeoff as well as the landing, right? So they're in from the beginning and can be helping to shape the perceptions of what is needed in the community, how to meet those needs while also supporting the broader economic growth of a country or city, and making sure that all of the stakeholders are at the table. One of the, sorry, Susan, go ahead.
Just to say, that was one of my big points, that you need to let the communities and people, rural communities, be in the driver's seat. They're making the right decisions, about these things. Exactly.
Yeah, there's so, and I think that's where we're starting to see a shift in a number of different, like sort of the disaster risk reduction community, in the development community, in the security communities, of this recognition that we're not going to be able to develop the comprehensive and integrated responses if we're not including those who are most affected. Let's see, I think that I just saw a note that the interpreter is muted. Carlos, can you make sure that you're not muted so that Miriam can, okay, good. There's some really good questions that have come through and I want to get to those, but first I want to do one more round, thinking about developing those more effective predictive capabilities in the region, and ways to ensure that the efforts and investments that are being developed right now are deployed in ways that that get us to a better future, right? I think Amina Mohammed spoke this morning about, she's a Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, and she laid out 3 different agenda items for better strategic foresight. And one of them was addressing inequalities. And another one was the importance of integrating gender into the discussion. And I want to get to that point in particular in just a minute, but looking at the inequalities, I think, her focus was addressing inequalities to build resilience into climate change and to ensure that in our efforts to address climate change, we're not leaving anybody behind. But I think that there's like a deeper question of justice and equity in this that goes beyond looking forward and recognizes sort of the legacies of injustice that have been experienced and have gotten us to where we are today, and how to be mindful of those and meaningfully integrate our understanding of those into the efforts that we're informing today. We have a project at the Wilson Center with Roger Polwardy at NOAA that's focused on improving predictive capabilities for the security risks posed by climate change. And I know it aligns in a lot of ways with some of the work that Erin's led at the Center for Climate Security and others. In that work, we've developed a framework for how to better understand what climate risks we'll be facing. And the importance of that is recognizing that there's existing environmental vulnerabilities outside of climate change in a given location, right? There's political instability within a country that's going to shape how climate risks are experienced and the ability to respond to them. There's transboundary and regional dynamics that are also going to play a role. And then there's this we call it the scales of decision making. There's finding ways to meaningfully engage at the local community in ways that don't put a burden on local community and sort of outstrip their capacity to engage. So making sure that they have the tools and resources to meaningfully engage in these conversations, all the way up to the state level, the regional and international level. And that's the only way we're really going to be able to recognize risks in advance and set up the systems to address them and be more responsive when an emergency does occur. Erin, I think you have such a unique perspective, having spent so much time in the intelligence community, and given your role now at CCS, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the role that predictive capabilities can play in developing resilience strategies.
Sure, it's a good question, and you laid out some of the opportunities there vis-a-vis predictive capabilities. I mean, one of the great benefits we have with climate change and understanding where it's going is our predictive capabilities, and the physical effects of climate change are quite good, right? And the tools we have to model things are quite good. I think the challenge, there are two challenges. One is, as you were laying out, marrying those capabilities with issues around governance and other data streams and decision making and all of that. And so how do you take the kind of tangible piece of the physical risks and marry it with the less tangible and more uncertain, right? And how do you build models and capabilities that can encompass all of those issues? And so that's one challenge. And I think that's something that within the US government, I think, over time there's been a struggle with, is how do you build models that are useful that can encompass all of these different data points. But then the other challenge, and this gets to the inequality question you were just talking about, is how do you get these tools in the hands of those that need them, especially at those local community levels, so that they can make better decisions themselves, right? How do we build their toolbox, if you will, of tools they have, because knowledge about the future is real power in making good decisions, right? And so the translation piece, and again, that's something we struggle with here in the US, and getting it to mayors and local communities within the US states, much less, into communities in Central America. And I think that needs to be a real focus, because every day now you see new companies with new AI tools that are going to show you the great predictive capabilities about climate so we can make better decisions. But those tools are useless if they're not in the hands of people who actually are going to be acting on the ground, right? And that's the challenge there, and I think should be a real focus for a lot of work for organizations like ours and the Wilson Center, is how do you activate the use of these tools going forward, and then incorporate data streams or information that those local communities will have that we here wouldn't have access to otherwise, right? The other thing I'll say on the predictive capabilities, I think, is important. There are other ways to use the tools, like scenarios exercises or tabletop exercises in gaming, that help people just think through how these physical risks may play out in different ways. And that's another place in which integrating that local perspective is so important as well, but can be really powerful for bringing different actors around the table and having them have a chance to interact with one another. So take a snapshot of physical climate risks in a certain geography and then bring people together to talk about different pathways in which that may shape conflict, may shape instability, may shape migration to get ahead of it. Is another way to use the tools that engages folks in important ways.
Thank you, Erin. Susan, I think, both Erin and I talked about everybody here started to engage local communities. And there's, the US has announced it would provide increased assistance to El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras to address irregular migration. At the same time, USAID has pledged to provide 25% of its funding directly to local partners over the next 4 years. I would love to hear from you how that, I know you're thinking about this, how that money could best be deployed, and then, but what is needed to help communities on the ground be able to access it, first of all, and then sort of deploy it? Like, what sort of capacity building do we need to be supporting so that communities can take full advantage of this direct support?
Okay, well, yeah, really, if we're gonna think about catalyzing processes, and going back, the region is characterized by diversity of efforts and initiatives that are being led by campesino, family agricultural, Afro-descendant, indigenous people, and other traditionally marginalized sectors, such as women and youth. And they're being accompanied by civil society in multiple ways, but as essential as these are, they're insufficient, they're fragmented, and given the magnitude and the complexity of the ongoing threats they face, like Miriam was saying, they're being criminalized. So in that context, it really becomes essential to promote the articulation of civil society, or we talk about creating a territorially rooted institutional scaffolding for civil society that strengthens their interactions and negotiations with governments, the private sector, donors, and other actors. Yeah, civil society should be seen as an asset that must be fully mobilized and supported to scale up resilience efforts on the ground. And in the long term, they should be strategically linked to effectively accompany the struggles of territorial actors to build and defend not only resilient agendas, but to defend democratic, inclusive, sustainable, and resilient societies. They're really the champions of this. And that means a much more deliberate effort of planned collaboration and strategic alliances to overcome current fragmentation and to strategically consolidate their collective knowledge. There's no one thing that needs to be done, and really it's a whole scaffolding in the way that funds in the past, in the 80s with the wars in the region. There was a lot of USAID was giving funding to the private sector for the solutions. This time it's the civil society and territorial actors have the solutions, and they're the ones that need to be funded and create an institutional scaffolding that really supports their efforts in all different ways. And that could include strategic litigation and legal support, knowledge management systems, building on communities' own accumulated traditional knowledge, technical assistance of different forms, management on strategies for the production and linkages with markets of their products, of agroecological projects, strengthening administrative and financial capacities, and to support leadership formation. So all of those things. And that's where I get back to what I said earlier in the last time. I mean, mechanisms need to be constructed that allow that facilitate that. And not only to facilitate that kind of support, but also to level the playing field, the dispute over who makes decisions, you know? So just to kind of say that.
Thank you, Susan. Miriam, I'd be curious to hear from you if you know, I think a lot of your work, as I understand it, has been defending your communities and resisting sort of larger powers who are trying to take over land or make decisions that are going to undermine what your community wants and needs, right? Have you had, are there any situations where somebody's come to you to work together and you've seen it as like a beneficial relationship that from the beginning has allowed you to develop a project or a program or I don't know, campaign or something that is really positive leaning, and this partner, whether they're sort of at the state level or from an international group, has come in sort of with the right angle from the beginning, and what that has been like? Has that happened?
Pues no hemos tenido nada. No hemos tenido ningún acercamiento, así como no tenemos experiencia de eso. Estamos construyendo nuestras propias propuestas, ¿verdad? Alternativas. Estamos luchando contra la siembra de palma africana. Tenemos un proyecto innovador muy bonito, se llama Vallecito, donde estamos sembrando coconíferas y estamos en medio de un mar de palma africana, pero estamos construyendo nuestro propio proceso y es algo impulsado desde la OFRAME. Nosotros no hemos tenido hasta la fecha a alguien que nos diga, bueno, para que podamos, yo creo que es una buena pregunta, Lauren, porque tiene que ver un poco con lo que decía Susan, ¿no? La posibilidad también de que los movimientos sociales y organizaciones sociales podamos impulsar y contemos con el apoyo y el respaldo también institucional de los gobiernos para poder impulsar esos procesos que a la larga son proyectos y procesos que pueden contribuir pues, a minimizar o realmente generar, digamos, prevención pues, sobre el tema del cambio climático.
Okay. I'm going to go to the questions in the chat and in the Q&A. I had mentioned that Amina Mohammed had highlighted gender as an issue. I don't know why I just waved my Zoom is so weird sometimes. But we have a piece out actually. Maybe Amanda, if you're there, could you drop Chantal's piece in the chat? Written by a Wilson Center fellow who was the director of the Women in International Security until recently, who wrote a piece about gender, climate, and security. And it really sort of highlights the gap in integrating gender into climate security discussions and the myriad of reasons for that gap and the need to be focusing on it and doing a better job of integrating gender considerations into climate security. So one of the questions is to Miriam, but all of you can answer, is the role of gender in the experience of these climate crises and in addressing them. I don't know if you're familiar with the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, Miriam, but that's a framework that has been very successful in helping the security community understand the role of women as decision makers can't think of the word right now, but as playing a role in peace and security. In your work, I know that you're supportive of youth and women. Can you talk about what it's been, the role that women have played in the efforts that you are driving on the ground?
Bueno, yo quiero partir de la experiencia propia del pueblo garífuna. El pueblo garífuna es matrifocal, matrilineal, es un pueblo donde las mujeres jugamos un papel muy importante, no solamente para participar como en reuniones, sino que en la toma de decisiones. Y además que en la última década, recordemos que las mujeres somos las que están enfrente, estamos enfrente en la lucha por la defensa del ambiente. Las mujeres estamos presentes para defender las semillas, para defender el agua, para defender. Mucha gente me pregunta, miren, ¿por qué crees que en esta última década las mujeres son las que están poniendo el cuerpo? Están poniendo las, digamos, ideas, pensamientos, pero es que las mujeres nos tocó ya tomar decisiones en estas últimas décadas, ¿no? Para decir, bueno, tenemos que las mujeres también tomar ya control y poner nuestra mano, nuestro cuerpo, pero también la construcción de nuevos procesos y modelos de vida, formas de vida, porque la que se ha construido en los últimos años, que ha estado en manos de hombres, y discúlpenme todos los hombres que están escuchando, está mal, ha sido mal construida. Y creo que nos toca a las mujeres con esa visión que tenemos, porque mucha gente me dice, bueno, yo digo que las mujeres pensamos en los hijos de los hijos, de nuestros hijos. Y yo creo que hijos, hijas, y creo que eso nos hace pensar en el futuro, ¿no? Yo creo que es importante entender eso. Porque mucha gente me dice, ¿y por qué las mujeres? ¿Por qué ahora las mujeres están emergiendo? Es que nos dimos cuenta que lo que ha estado funcionando en los últimos años no nos apoya, no nos contribuye a la humanidad, y entonces las mujeres estamos tomando, digamos, el sartén por el mango para decir, bueno, miren, un momentito, hay que detenerse, detengámonos y vamos a empujar esta carreta juntos y juntas, los hombres y las mujeres, para que puedan tener mejores condiciones de vida para las futuras humanidades, futura humanidad.
Thank you, Miriam. There's 5 minutes left, and I'm trying to think about how we can answer some of these really important questions. So what I'll do is I'm gonna ask them and then give you each minute to respond to whichever you would like to. Following up on that, a question from Nagar Abe at USIP is, how can we better support women, environmental, and peace defenders in Central America? There's a question in both the chat and the Q&A about corporations. So one question in the chat is, how do we address and gain corporate support along with building social resilience? I think this is a really important question. There was a report that came out by Global Canopy that last week that talked about sort of the political commitments that countries made at COP26 compared to the commitments made by corporations that are doing a lot of the have a hand in the deforestation, and the gap between the countries that have committed to addressing deforestation and the companies who are responsible for it, and their lack of commitment, and then even for those who have made commitments, their lack of fulfilling those commitments. And so this ensuring that it has to be more than a country-led effort, right? It's sort of an all of society, all of, and corporations need to be part of that. So there's that question, how do we address and gain corporate support? And then at the same time, Amira Warren Yerby wrote, what can people do today within our community around climate change? Because of this sort of current gap in government action, in corporate action, how can we take action as individuals, right? And I think some of that is in terms of communicating to your governments the need to have decisions that are reflective of our current needs. Okay, so question about engaging corporations, and a question about, and with that, how can we act as individuals? And then how do we support women environmental defenders? I think, Susan, I will start with you.
Okay, wow, I'm not sure which one does, but let's talk about corporations, and I'll maybe talk about the realities in Central America about the private sector. We actually carried out a whole mapping of all the actors that are involved in climate change, whether they're, illicit actors, narco-trafficking because they're controlled territory, whether it's the private sector because of the investments they're making, whether it's the civil society actors and territorial actors, or governments. And I think it's important to kind of we still have a problem with kind of, I'm trying to put this together well, a way of thinking, and it goes back to this question that Miriam said that has to do with development. The private sector in the end, its goal is accumulation and growth, right? And so that needs to be, it's kind of an endless imperative. That needs to be switched. And so, and it also has to do with kind of the gender issues, kind of this individual or collective approach to benefits and resources and growth, and what is development, you know, is it something individualized for someone, one person to grow? And we're actually seeing in the private sector a permanent expansion and diversification of business events that are based on extractive industries like infrastructure, energy, monocultures. And in some sectors, particularly the agricultural sectors, such as the large sugar, palm, and coffee producing companies, they actually have been promoting perhaps some actions of climate resilience through investments like in technology, changes in practices, and the generation of key information like hydrometeorological data. But the majority of the business sectors that adopt discourses that incorporate concern for climate change tend to focus on mitigation, not only to take advantage of new investment opportunities, because that's their logic, but also to legitimatize their extractivist economic activities such as energy, and to maintain their influence in spaces in which climate responses are being discussed. So in short, while climate change has forced certain companies to modify their production practices and business models, it is not yet a strategic issue for the private sector in any of the 3 countries that we analyze, but rather an investment opportunity that in certain cases actually provokes social environmental conflicts and undermine adaptation opportunities. And so I say that not to say that we can't work with, we have to work with others, but we need to do that with a very understanding what is the logic and which companies, and much more carefully. And that's why I keep saying, get actors, territorial actors involved, because they're seeing the results of these actions. It might be one concept, oh, this is good, it will create jobs, but they're not seeing the results of it. And so it's a very touchy topic, and especially in areas like this where there's huge disputes for control.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth a whole other conference, frankly.
Yes.
And I'm sorry, so we're at 12:15. So Miriam and Aaron, I'm sorry, I'm going to give you like 30 seconds each. We want USIP and Alliance for Peace Building to allow us to come back next year. And so we'll try to stick to time. Miriam, why don't you go ahead?
Sí, no, yo solamente quisiera decir, Lauren, compañeras, en mis 30 segundos, quiero plantear 3 cosas fundamentales. Una es que deben de ser sancionadas ya las empresas, porque están contribuyendo mucho a la crisis climática. Hay que buscar una forma, no basta decirle la responsabilidad social, ya no, eso, porque lo que hacen más bien es hacer cosas que para mitigar así, o para poder decir, estamos cumpliendo con estándares internacionales, pero no hay cambios sustanciales. Y también tenemos que luchar contra la corrupción y la impunidad. No puede haber lucha para defender la crisis climática cuando vivimos en escenarios de corrupción e impunidad tan profundas, en las cuales se toman decisiones a partir del dinero que se consigue. El último, se deben de elaborar planes y estrategias comunitarias locales y territoriales para la mitigación, prevención y acciones de resiliencia, como lo dicen ustedes, sobre la crisis climática. Y deben de ser realmente que las comunidades participen con sus ideas, sus propuestas, y creo que eso es básico, respetando las formas de decisión de las comunidades. Muchísimas gracias por haberme dado la oportunidad de estar con ustedes el día de hoy.
Thank you so much, Miriam. Aaron, go ahead, sorry.
Sure, no, I would just say, I mean, Miriam and Susan covered a lot. I think both the gender and the corporate issues underscore the importance of busting down silos in terms of how we deal with these issues and finding spaces like this where we can have intersectional conversations about gender, climate, and security together, and policymakers who are making decisions in each of those areas coming together and seeing how their work complements one another and supports one another in their decision is so important, because you can't separate these out into different streams of work. They need to come together. So I'll leave it at that. But thank you so much for hosting us, Lauren, and keeping us on task.
Thank you, Erin, for co-hosting. Susan, Miriam, Erin, you're all incredible. I love an all-woman panel. I missed Roger, but you know, this is great. Thank you for the work that you're doing, and we will certainly be in touch. Thank you for all of those of you who are listening in, and please feel free to get in touch if you have any follow-up questions or comments to share. Thank you very much.